Today is all about really understanding or getting cozy with the residential purchase agreement and some supporting documents as well. I recommend that when you are about to write an offer, think about it as you're interviewing for the position. It's not only about the terms in the agreement, it's about how you are reflecting your professionalism to the seller, how you're reflecting your professionalism to the listing agent. In other words, don't be a lazy agent. Make sure that you have everything teed up so beautifully that you're going to minimize the work that the listing agent is going to have to do. Don't leave them anything to clean up. Don't leave them an opportunity to call you and say, hey, you forgot to put that in there. So again, be that professionalism and the mindset as you're interviewing for this position, for this job. Put on your best suit and tie, basically. And part of that is also setting up your client, your buyer, with expectations. Specifically, when you write an offer for them and they receive it via DocuSign, most often, right? That should not be the first time that they are seeing the RPA and supporting documents. It's very confusing to look at that for the first time, especially if you're not a licensed realtor. So during your buyer consultation or any opportunity before you write that offer, give them hard copies or a PDF and go over the hot spots with them. That's typically what I do. I go over the hot spots. I don't pay so much attention to the boilerplate stuff, but if you present this to them ahead of time, when they do receive that offer to sign online, they know what to look for. They're going to check it out, and you're probably not going to get a call. And it's going to get signed quickly, and then of course over to the listing agent. All right. So now that you've all interviewed for the position and you set your client up for expectations, let's dive into the RPA. I'm going to pull it up here. So part of setting your clients up for success is explaining to them during that consult that they're going to get other documents associated with the RPA that are front-loaded. I'm not going to spend really any time on this, but I'm going to just review it with you. So they're going to get the AD, the agency disclosure, which establishes the relationship. They're going to get the fair housing and discrimination advisory. They're going to receive the PRBS, which is possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory, and the BHIA, the Buyer Homeowners Insurance Advisory, which is something really new as of December of last year because of our insurance landscape, which is very challenging, as you know. Then they will come across the RPA, the Residential Purchase Agreement. So I'm going to go over this with you in some detail, and I'm going to provide tips that will represent you as the professional. And some of the tips I give are some areas that a lot of agents just skip, and there's, I'll do that later. However, if you skip something and you'll just get to it later, with all things equal in a multiple offer situation, that seller is probably going to pick the offer that has less cleaning up to do. So keep that in mind, please. The first thing is paragraph 1 is about what's going on. Who is who and what is the date? This date, March 13th, that is not a date that has anything to do with timelines or ratification date. This is the date it was prepared. And sometimes you might think, that date needs to be the same date as I submit the offer. That's not so. This is just the date of the offer of when it was prepared. Of course, you want the seller name, good old boo-boo, and the property. This is where some agents get a little lazy. They don't put in the parcel number, the APN. Didn't have time to look it up. Maybe the TC didn't have access to it for some reason, although they do. But this is something you never want to skip, because the seller will then have to counter, put that in there, go back and clean it up. So don't be lazy. Always put the APN there. You find the APN in MLS, through MLS via the Realist tax link, and you can always find that there. Then it goes down into agency disclosure. The seller's brokerage firm, this example is we're representing the buyer. So the seller's brokerage firm is the other side of the transaction, and always put their agent name here. And I also see a lot of times the agent license number isn't included. That's another area in which might represent you as being a lazy agent. So always make sure that you have the agent license number there. Of course, up top is the brokerage number. And if they're representing the seller, which they are, those boxes are checked, and you're representing the buyer. So these boxes are checked, and the real brokerage number, your name, your license. Keep in mind, I just want to acknowledge that when you're writing your offers, you're using the type form, and our TC team is doing all of this work for you, but you need to provide them with accurate information. And then when it comes back for your signatures from the TC team, you need to verify that everything is on that contract as you need it to be. Who's responsible for any errors on the contract? You or the TC? You are. It's your license, it's your name on the contract, and you hold everything that comes down from this, so make sure everything is correct. So once this top part is filled out, then we get to what I call the grid, terms and conditions. Obviously, the offer price is the offer price. It goes here. If it's all cash, you click this box, but it is not all cash in this example. Close of escrow date. It's most common we just put 30 days or 45 days. Sometimes you could be strategic if, for example, after speaking with the listing agent prior to writing the offer and finding out what is important to the seller, maybe the seller wants a specific date that that's going to close on, for example. So if that's the case, you put a specific date by clicking this box, and then of course picking that date, whatever it might be. In this example, we're going to go 30 days, which is most common. Expiration of the offer is another area in which you can be strategic. Depending on the situation, you may want to just have it default, which is 3 calendar days after all buyer signatures. That's a great thing to do, and actually, in my opinion, when you know there's going to be multiple offers, and there's going, you already know of other agents that are writing on this, and there's going to be 5 offers coming, I actually have the perspective of just leaving it at the default at 3 calendar days, because they're going to get together, they're going to, probably counter everybody or accept the highest and the best, and it may take some time to decide on that. And in that case, you know that they're going to make a decision quick, and you're in the game. I just usually leave it to the default. One strategy of when I do tighten up that timeline for a response is if the home has been on the market for 2 or 3 weeks and I'm the only person in the game, that's when I do tighten up that timeline, sometimes to 12 hours if I know that the seller can respond in that amount of time. And here's why. When the home has been on the market for 3 weeks, for example, and you submit an offer, you're the only one that seller's looking at, what you don't want to do is give that listing agent an opportunity to shop your offer. In other words, they aren't going to express the terms of your offer. They're not supposed to. I'm going to get that in a minute. But they will call all of the other buyers that have been kind of hanging around, kind of interested. They're going to call all those buyer agents and say, hey, I just got an offer. If you guys want to play ball, get it into me straight away. So if you leave it to the default of 3 calendar days, you're giving that opportunity, you're opening up that window for that listing agent to create a multiple offer situation. So, part of calling that listing agent ahead of time, before you write the offer, find out how much time your sellers realistically need to respond. Are they local? Yes, they're living in the house. Usually 12 hours or 24 hours is sufficient. What you don't want to do is not have that conversation with the listing agent and then hit them with a 10-hour turnaround. That will probably ruffle some feathers. So again, it's all about communication, establishing that relationship with the listing agent, and talk about how fast the sellers can respond. The initial deposit, very familiar with everybody, right? Typically, depending on the market area, it's usually 3% right up front, or it could be 1% or 2%, depending on the standard of practice in your particular marketplace. And that needs to be deposited within 3 days is the default. Here's another tip. If your clients, your buyers, if the cash is liquid, which usually it is, and you're in an multiple offer situation, why leave that 3 days? Why not have it 1 day? It's not going to cost your client any more money, and it's going to show that seller that, oh, boy, these guys are really serious. They aren't going to wait 3 days to put their earnest money in. They're going to do it in 1 day. That's a way to strengthen your offer without costing your clients any more money. All of these little things make a difference, right? Daniel.
My question is, have you ever got a counter offer because of that earnest deposit percentage? So let's say you put 1% and then they countered with, oh, you need to pay 2 or 3. Is that something that happens?
Yes, it is. Sometimes that seller wants to see that buyer have a little bit more skin in the game. I don't, my perspective is I don't understand why a buyer wouldn't put a 3% deposit so long as it doesn't exceed their down payment. If it's a VA, sometimes you do 0 down, right? So,
Yeah.
it just depends. But yes, you can get countered on that. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I just feel like for your buyer, you want to do 1% every time, in my opinion, because it's cheaper for them.
Usually they're not at the end of the day, no, because they're going to have to, this goes towards a down payment, right? So it doesn't cost them any money.
Towards the closing costs, yeah.
Right. So, yeah, I think it might.
Just out of pocket, it's not as much out of pocket because you need that within the first 3 days,
That's right. You need that within the first 3 days, or, you can negotiate it to be longer than 3 days. You can put 5 days.
Yeah.
But I think that's going to weaken your offer. Okay. I recommend to strengthen the offer without costing your clients any more money, do 3%. If they have that available, if they have that liquid cash available within the amount of time that it's going to be entered.
I would also recommend for everybody else to sit down and, have another day to talk about this offer and what all this stuff means besides the buyer consult, because that could be a month, 2 months before, 3 months before. So just talk to your buyer about all this stuff and how much money they'll need to have right away.
Absolutely. That's great advice, Daniel. Thank you. So once you have this established, the next D2 is an increased deposit, which is not common at all, especially in the way we practice today. If there is an increased deposit, one of the examples would be, we used to do this 10 years ago a lot. We would initially do 1.5% with the offer, and then upon removal of all contingencies, we would increase to another 1.5% for a total of 3%. That's not so common anymore, so we won't spend too much time on that. All right, here's an area where a lot of agents are misinformed. And when I say a lot of agents, I'm not speaking to C2 Realty. I'm just speaking in general terms that I see a lot. Of course, you have the loan amount. How much is being financed? In my example here, on $1 million purchase, $800,000 is being financed. So it's an 80% loan to value. You don't have to put this here. Actually, pardon me, you do now. You want to put a cap on the interest rate not to exceed. And here's why. If your buyer does not want to pay any more than 6.5%, and you're in an environment where rates are a little volatile, and it goes to 8%, for example, and the buyer still has the ability to close to get his financing or their financing on 8%, you cannot cancel the contract based on a loan contingency because you did not put a cap here. Now, if interest rates pop up to 8% in this scenario, and your buyer still has the ability to do that, his DTI would still be in line, you can cancel the contract based on this right here. Again, if it's not there, you're basically telling that seller that if rates go up to 10% and your buyer can still, qualify for that, they have to move forward with the sale, unless they might risk losing their deposit. Also, what is required now is also to put in how many points to obtain the rate above. So if your buyer is buying points to get that 6.5%, or I just had a buyer get, believe it or not, 6.25, which was pretty damn good, and they did have a point, you have to put that point in there. And this is a conversation you want to have with your lender and your buyer of how that loan is being structured. One of the things that I do not recommend doing is if rates are at 6.25 today, you probably shouldn't put 6.25. You should probably bump it up a little bit after a conversation with the lender and your buyer, because that's a reasonable thing to do, right? But if your buyer is not going to be able to afford a 7% loan, don't put 7% in there. Of course, over here, the type of financing defaults is conventional. If it's FHA or VA, of course, mark those two boxes. If it's seller financing, please make sure that your buyer has an attorney that they hire to review what the seller financing looks like. There's lots of risks associated with seller financing and liability that you want to protect your buyer from. If it is FHA or VA, deliver a list of the lender required repairs within a certain amount of time. I usually leave that default if it is FHA or VA, and that's typically fine. Additional financed amount interest rate. This is if there's a second mortgage on the financing. We don't see a lot of that right now in this lending environment, but if there is a second, there's nothing different here. It would be the same format, certainly different numbers, but the same approach that you have on your first loan amount.
Does it matter, like if they have, like maybe they have a silent second that helps with their down payment or deposit? Does it matter if you put, like the major loan up top, or you put the silent second up top, or even if it's not silent, because I don't know the difference.
When you say silent, I'm assuming like a private loan, a hard money loan, something like that.
Just a lot of down payment assistance programs in some areas. Like it doesn't necessarily count if you keep the home over like 10 years.
Right.
It won't collect on it. So would that be...
So there's down payment assistance programs is what you're referring to. And that would be a conversation to have with your lender of how they would want that shown or structured on the RPA, if at all. So that would be definitely a conversation to have with the lender. Occupancy type always defaults to primary. If it's checked secondary or investment, typically, sometimes you need to see this if it's a condominium, and if it's an investor and that condominium complex already is at their max of percentage of units allowed to be rented in that community. Sometimes that seller, of course, isn't going to accept it, or maybe there's rental restrictions. What you don't want to do is know that you're shopping with a buyer who is purchasing a home for primary occupancy, or pardon me, for investment purposes. They're going to rent it out. And then they say, Martin, don't check the investment box because I'm going to buy it as a primary because I'm going to get a cheaper interest rate. Well, they just committed fraud, right? So FYI.
A question about that. So I know with FHA, you have to live in it for 1 year at the very minimum. But let's say you go conventional and you do intend to rent it out, but to get, I guess you can get a lower rate if you owner occupy it versus investing it out or renting it out.
Yeah.
What if you live in it for a month just to get away with that? Is that a thing?
Here's what you would have to say in a court of law. What was your intention? If your intention is to buy this house as your primary residence, and you do that, and you actually move in, and then you lose your job 3 months later, and you have to move back in with family, and you're going to rent it out because that's better than losing it, right?
Right.
I'm not a judge, but I would say you're probably going to be okay, and nobody's going to, call you out, if you will. Your lenders aren't necessarily going back and going to audit these things. But if you put on your tax return that now it's an investment property, and your property tax bill is not going to the primary residence anymore, it's going to a different residence, and all of these other clues are popping up, you might get a call from somebody servicing that loan. And if they find that you did commit fraud, they may call the loan. I don't know. But generally speaking, it's all about intention. And I've done it. In fact, the place I'm sitting in here right now, I bought it as my primary years ago. And then 6 months later, I moved out and rented it because I had a change of plans. And I slept very, very well because my intention was true and honest up front. That's the best answer I can give. Seller credit, if any, to buyer. If there is any credits that you're going to ask for straight up, that would go here. Keep in mind that your lender needs to know about all seller credits to buyer. They would certainly see it here. But the lender is going to restrict how much money or credit they can get from the seller. It has to do with the type of loan, to showing the ability that they can service the loan. So again, if it's a large credit, you should probably have a conversation with the lender first.
Hey, really quick, just to the point that you just said, do you have to verbalize that to anybody or pass that message along to the whoever gave you the loan? Like, do you have to communicate that you're moving out and doing the...
No, don't do it. No. You don't need to say anything.
Okay.
There's absolutely nothing you need to do other than box up your stuff and go.
Okay.
Yep. Good question, though. Yep. There's no obligation to do that. Any additional finance terms would go here. Again, if there's any additional finance terms, you need to have a conversation with the lender. I usually don't see this used much at all.
Where would we put if the seller agreed to buy down, like the interest rate or like with seller's credit? Where do we put that?
It would be here or here. And I'm a little bit, I've never done a 3-2-1 buy down. So that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to say much on that answer, Cassie. So I will get the answer for you, but I believe it goes in G1. But I'm going to find out for you, and I'll email everybody that answer, okay? And that's a great example of never guess the answer if you don't know it when you're dealing with contracts. So when you're representing a buyer or a seller, never assume anything. If you don't know the answer, go find it. This is a very important box for you to know right here, G3. If you have a buyer broker, buyer representation, buyer broker compensation form in effect before you wrote this offer, and I know that Daniel has quite a few of them out there, and you know that the compensation in MLS is 2%, and your agreement that you have with your buyer is 2.5%. You, the agent, can ask that seller to pay that gap of 0.5%. If that's the case, you have to mark this box, and it's going to populate the SPBB form, which I'll get to later. So table that. But if you have a buyer agreement, broker compensation in effect signed by your buyer, and there is a gap in that compensation in which you're going to try to negotiate with the seller to pay, mark this box, hold that thought. This is another area, H1, verification of all cash, verification of down payment, and verification of loan application, where some agents get a little bit lazy, and I'll tell you why. Part of the offer is to show the seller that the buyer has the ability to perform. The buyer has the ability to pay that down payment that they're saying, that 20%, right? A lot of lenders will just give you a templated pre-approval letter, and not all of them say that funds to close have been verified. If it doesn't have something to that effect, that type of verbiage, funds to close have been verified, which means that, you know, closing costs, and for example, and down payment, what you'll need to provide is a screenshot is suffice of your buyer's bank account with their name on it and the date, account numbers blacked out, showing the amount equal to or more than the down payment that is reflected on this offer. So typically, if you're writing an offer and they have a pre-approval, the lender usually has already verified that they have that cash. So ask them to put that in their pre-approval letter that funds have been verified. It's cleaner. That's my recommendation.
And I wanted to add, sometimes it's best not to don't exceed that amount, because then they're going to ask for more. So I like to kind of keep it as to what our offer is. Yeah,
there's no reason to show more, but if it is more, I don't know. I don't think it matters because the buyer's going to pay what the buyer's going to pay. It might work to their advantage. They may say, well, this guy has the ability to close. We know that he's not going by the skin of his teeth, which actually might show strength. But that is one thought, Melanie, as well, that you know, there's no reason to show more than they need to show. All right, so final verification of property condition. We usually leave that at 5 days to walk through. Assignment request. If there's an assignment or nominee, usually it's set within 17 days to assign the contract. Notice up here I put fully underwritten. Most of my buyers are fully underwritten because it doesn't take any more work to get your buyer fully underwritten. In fact, it's less stressful for them to do it up front, because if they wait until they get into escrow with a pre-approval, they're going to have to rush to get all of their documents in before that whatever contingency timeline that you set for loan approval. So do them a favor, save them a lot of stress, and make their offer stronger and get them fully underwritten. Please, 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 because they can compete with cash. In this case, I'm saying they're fully underwritten. So we're going to waive the loan contingency after a conversation with the lender and buyer to see if they still feel comfortable with that. Appraisal. Even though loan contingency is waived, they want to make sure in this example that they aren't paying too much for it. And notice over here in L2, I put $960,000. I think this box is underutilized. Basically what this means is the buyer is saying, hey, seller, I'm happy to pay $1 million for it, even if it only appraises at $960,000. And this is good to use in a multiple offer situation to strengthen the offer. And this could theoretically not cost the buyer any more money, but it would cost them out-of-pocket money. Because if the appraisal does come in at 960, that buyer now has to come up dollar for dollar to increase their down payment by $40,000. So have that conversation with them before you put that in there. Make sure they understand. There's been some challenges out there in our industry where some people think it's only a percentage of. So if the buyer is doing 20% down and there's a $40,000 appraisal gap, and they think, oh, I only have to pay 20% of that $40,000. No, it's dollar for dollar.
Yeah, in this scenario, what if it appraises at 940 or 950?
Buyer can cancel. Investigation of property. If you have a complete disclosure package up front, and let's say it's only missing one thing, do you really need 17 days? Probably not, depending on the characteristics of the property. I recommend that don't leave everything to the default, especially if you want to win offers. Strategically think about what you're doing and what needs to be done, how you can position your buyer in a position to win. If you have a complete disclosure package, everything is in there, all of the required statutory disclosures, home inspection, pest inspection, sewer lateral inspection, every inspection that buyer wants to get and that you recommend they get, if it's all in there and they're totally fine with it, talk about waiving the contingencies and also talk about the risks of doing so. But what I'm driving at is don't leave everything to the default just because it's defaulted on the contract. Save yourself from getting a possible counter. Informational access to the property, I see this often left to 17 days. This is an interesting one. What this means is after your inspections are done, and let's say that was 17 days, contractually, you're not able to go into that property until your VOP, your verification of property condition. I like to push it out to marry that VOP 5 days. So in this example, my buyers have access to the property for that 30-day escrow. Because sometimes your clients want to go measure something. They want to measure for new appliances. They want to do all of these other things. And even if it's vacant, you still need permission to go into the property. But that's the purpose of this particular AC-12.
Do the listing agents pretty strictly control 8C12?
Strictly control.
Not strictly control, but like I guess a better phrasing would be, do they enforce the informational access to the property?
I think it depends on how much control that listing agent likes to have. 1, 2, is the property occupied? And what is the characteristics of the property? Is it a high-end $10 million listing with expensive paintings on the wall? So I think it really depends on the situation. But keep in mind that even during your inspection contingency time frame of 17 days, for example, and the house is vacant, contractually you still need to inform the listing agent that you're going to the property. You just can't go show up. Unless you have a really good relationship with that listing agent and it's vacant, and you might be okay. But technically speaking, you always need to give them notice that you're going over, even when you have these days in there. Review of seller documents. I usually do leave that blank because it's 17 days. after acceptance or 5 days after delivery, whichever is later. You're usually getting the seller documents up front or within a very short period of time if they don't already have their disclosure package complete. Preliminary title report. I gave you a little example here of how you can tighten up or make your offer a little bit more attractive. If you don't need 17 days to remove the preliminary title report contingency, why leave it at 17 days? Why not tighten it up to 5? And you can do that with a lot of these contingencies based on the disclosure package that you have at the time of writing the offer. Common interest disclosures has to do with usually HOAs. Review of leased or liened items. If you know that place has solar on it, if you know that it has a propane tank on the property, those items might be leased. So always be aware of that. Over here to the right, removal of waiver of contingencies. Remember, I waived loan contingency, so you click this box. And that's going to, we're going to talk about that in a minute. If your buyer needs to sell their property in order to buy this property, you would mark the CAR form COP, which is contingent of seller's property, of buyer's property. That is not so common right now, and that's another little training that we'll do. So we are not going to use that in this particular example. Time of possession is at time of recordation. That means not when the fund loans, when the loan funds, it's when it's actually recorded at the county assessor's office. That's when your buyer can then go into the property for 2 reasons, contractually and also liability. The liability shifts from the seller to the buyer when it's recorded at the county assessor's office. You can change that date if you want, but typically it's upon recordation. This is another item, M27C. This is for seller to remain in possession. If your seller might need a little time to get out and your buyer is fine, I'll close on this day and the seller can stay in there for 14 more days, and I'm not going to charge him anything, that's a way to strengthen your offer without costing your buyer any more money, right? So if there's that opportunity, it's that conversation you're having with the listing agent up front. What can we do to make the move out of your sellers easier? How can we relieve the stress? It'd be great if you can give them 2 weeks after close. And that's what this is for. Very, very, very powerful, especially if it's a senior couple. They've been in a home for 50 years and the place is stacked full. It's going to take them a while to go through all of that stuff and purge, and give them some time if your buyers have the ability to do that. This is the one that is missed a lot. Occupied units by tenants or anyone other than the seller. Here's an example. It's Boo Boo is the seller, and Boo Boo's partner has been living in the house for 5 years, but Boo Boo's partner is not on title. Boo Boo's partner does not own the house. Guess what? Actually, you need to mark the TOPA because it's requiring Boo Boo's partner to vacate at time of close. Boo Boo's already agreeing to it because Boo Boo's signing the contract, right? Another example is the seller has a son that's home from college and has been living in the studio above the garage. It applies to that as well. So keep in mind, if there's anyone living in the house that's not on title, even if they're a couple, you need to check this. That's a risk management tip. Time for performance for documents, fees, and compliance. I typically leave these to the default. These are all basically, seller delivery of documents, sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions, time to pay fees for HOA ordering documents, which is pretty important. You want to make sure that the seller, if you don't already have the HOA disclosures, that they're on that, because sometimes they take a week, sometimes 2, if it's a little mom and pop HOA management company. You want to make sure that they're on that. Installing smoke alarm CO detectors and water heater bracing, usually fine at 7 days, unless you have an all-cash sale and it's going to close for 5 days, right? That's usually all just left. All right, items included in the sale. Can you rely on what the MLS says? A lot of agents do. They just rely if the MLS says, it includes the refrigerator. The MLS is not necessarily a binding agreement. It could probably win in the courtroom, but it's not really a binding agreement as far as the characteristics of the house. The commission compensation is. But you want to mark it. Even if it's a stove that's built in or a refrigerator that's built in, I mark it. Even if it's a wine refrigerator and they want it, I mark it. Even if it's a doorbell, video door, I mark it if that's what my client wants. Definitely mark it. Items excluded. An example would be metal shed in backyard. If you don't want it in there, write it in there. Natural hazards disclosure information, seller is going to pay for that unless you want to strengthen your offer and the buyer is going to pay for it. Typically, it's already paid for. It's usually in the disclosure package.
I put in an offer and then it got countered with the items that were in the house. So I would say have that conversation with the listing agent with, hey, what items, before you put the offer in, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Because it took a day and a half of time, which it doesn't matter in my situation, but it could if you had a real fast close and then you're like, oh, they want to counter on this. So just have that conversation.
Very good point. Thanks for bringing that up. Again, this is a conversation, as Daniel mentioned. It's when you're talking to that listing agent about what's included, what's not, and you're absolutely right. And this is the way to memorialize it, basically. Down here, this is who's going to do what down here as well. I usually have the seller do the required smoke detectors, government required point of sale. Are you in an area that requires sewer lateral inspection? If you are, you want to mark that. If you aren't sure, or if that municipality doesn't have any government required point of sale inspections, don't mark it just to be sure, because that's going to look like you don't know what you're talking about. So understand what's required in the area in which you're writing the offer on, be that professional and know about it. Because if you mark it and there are no required point of sale inspections, if the listing agent is a professional, they will counter you on that. They will say, take that out. We don't want it there. It doesn't exist. So that's something to keep in mind. Government required point of sale corrective. I usually do put seller on that because of water heater or smoke detector or something that's actually required. But that is often countered out. So it might be a conversation you have with the seller if you know what is required. Escrow fee is usually done by buyer. Title insurance usually done by buyer. This is all negotiable though. Transfer taxes are usually done by seller, at least in my area. In different marketplaces, sometimes it's split. Keep in mind, not all municipalities have a city transfer tax. So don't assume that every city has a transfer tax. Know your city, because if it doesn't have a transfer tax and you mark it, they will counter you. So don't be lazy. Know all of that info up front. If it is an HOA, I would mark seller pays for that fee. All right, we're almost done with this, and I'm going to get into some important supporting documents. Do want to mention that if you're buying the home warranty for your buyer, I usually put buyer, agent, and if you put buyer agent to purchase home warranty, there is usually where I put it. You don't need to put a price here. But if you're expecting the seller to pay for it, you would mark seller, and you do have to put a cost not to exceed there. And you can work with your title officer. They work with a lot of home warranty companies. They can help you decide what policy is appropriate for all of the components in the house. Let's go down, all the way down to here, liquidated damages. Please do not say to your buyer that, you can always get your deposit back. That's not the case. That's not the case. Release of all funds will require a mutual signed release instructions from both buyer and seller, judicial decision or arbitration award. 99.9% of the time, if your buyer is canceling within their right, according to the contract, they will get their deposit back, but not 100%. So just have the conversation around that. Don't misspeak, because the moment you misspeak is the moment you're going to look like a knucklehead. Okay? Keep in mind. Arbitration, mediation, basically this contract defaults to the parties agreeing to mediation. If it can't be solved with mediation, your clients need to mutually agree or not to arbitration, which is still less expensive than going and going to court and having a judge or a jury decide. So again, mediation. If it can't be solved in mediation, it goes to arbitration, should both buyer and seller agree to it. 99% of the time, buyers and sellers agree to liquidated damages and arbitration. Oh, one other thing. Don't be a lazy agent and not include the agent's name or their license number. I see that left blank a lot of the times. What you're just doing now is you're creating more work for the listing agent, because when they put their into DocuSign, or their TC puts this into DocuSign, they're going to have to pull a text box over. They're going to have to type their name, and they're going to have to type their license number. Don't cause them extra work. You do the work because you want your offer accepted. Leave as little for them to do as possible. These are things that strengthen your offer without costing your client any money.
Hey, really quick. I know you mentioned a few times, don't be a lazy agent. Yes. But in specific with you were talking about city taxes, and it depends on what your market is and understanding per city, what's required. Where's the resource for me to find out per city? Where am I looking all that up at?
Two places. One, the easiest and quickest way is to email Tracy, our TC. Her team will know. Or another great way, which you can get it very quickly, is call your favorite title officer in your area. They will provide everything for you. Who customarily pays for what fees, what cities have what transfer taxes. That's what I would do is establish a relationship with a title officer in your area.
Real quickly to add on to that, if you just Google who pays closing costs in California, one of the top searches is an Old Republic PDF, Old Republic Title Company PDF about the division of escrow, title fees, documentary taxes, as well as special city transfer taxes. And that's a quick and easy, handy guide there.
Quick and easy, handy guide. That's probably what I would do, but I'm never going to recommend people to do that, because what you find on the internet is not always true. That's just my little risk management response, JF. Yeah. But I would be going to the internet first probably too, but you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I hear you. Thanks, guys.
Yep. All right.
Sorry, Michael, it's Jen. I also just asked the listing agent as well, because they're usually, if you're not in the area, they'll love that you're wanting to help them. So they'll be super nice and be like, "Oh yeah, do it this way," So
very good recommendation.
Always great to do too.
Absolutely, absolutely. The listing agent is your friend. They want to get this deal done with you, right? So thanks for putting that out there, Jen. Absolutely.
Make it a conversation.
Make it a conversation. Absolutely. If you have a buyer representation broker compensation form in place and there's a gap and you want to have the seller bridge that gap, this is the form that you pull. Seller payment to buyer's broker, SPBB. You fill this out here, make sure it's dated on the date of the contract, not the date of ratification or the date that you're submitting it. This is the date that refers to the date in which you wrote the offer. Buyer representation agreement with compensation. Buyers entered into an agreement with the buyer agent, and that the buyer would make sure that the agent is made whole at 2.5%. MLS says that the seller or the broker is going to pay 2%. So as of the date of this seller, payment for buyer's broker document is signed by buyer and pursuant to the MLS, that's blank. That's what was throwing me. So in the MLS, it's showing 2%. And this is not seller to buyer. This is broker to broker. So broker 2.5% is what we have agreed for your buyer to pay you. Seller's broker in MLS is saying 2%. So there's a 0.5% difference. So on line 3, seller payment to buyer's broker shall be 0.5%, and that's going to bridge that gap. This number here cannot be any more than this number minus this number. Does that make sense? Here's the agreement you have with your buyer, 2.5%. Here's what MLS broker compensation is, 2%. Difference is 0.5%. So this number can't be any more than what that difference is there. That's what you need to send to the listing side if you want to make yourself whole on getting paid 2.5% when there's a difference being offered. Here is the buyer inspection waiver, the BIW. If you waive your inspections, not investigation, those two words are very, very different. But if you are waiving inspections, you need to have your buyer sign this and that they're acting against the advice of the broker. It's something that compliance risk management is going to want you to provide if you don't get it up front. You should probably have this signed at the time of the offer. It's not necessarily a required document. It's a really good practice, especially back in the day when we were writing offers with no contingencies. Everybody was waiving contingencies. I don't want to scare you, but now there is, I'm going to say it's accurate. There's a plethora of lawsuits from buyers suing brokers because they really didn't understand what they were waiving. So that's when this form was born. So that's a little bit of advice from a risk management perspective. All right, that was a lot. There's a lot more to it. I could spend 5 hours on this, but that was a really good overview. I think the most important thing is to really take your time and fill that puppy out as beautifully as you can. And when you do get it back from the TC team, when you get the form back in DocuSign, don't just click and sign. Look at it, make sure it's correct. Because humans are humans. We make typos. And you are responsible to everything on there. Yes, Miguel.
So, regarding like the broker commission, and I think it was Xavier who asked, about the 2.5, who would have to pay the difference if it was 2%. So I know I work with a couple of buyers who we don't have a buyer rep yet, but like I've seen their funds. I know like if they had to pay a difference, it might be too much for them to handle. But what if you do meet with someone, you get the 2.5% buyer rep signed, and then once you're in escrow for a property, you're calculating the cost, and then you realize, or your buyers realize, they can't afford to pay that 0.5% difference. Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like this is an obvious answer. Like, I think at that point you just kind of take the L and go with the 2%.
I would. I'm not going to be greedy. If I'm here for relationships, and you letting that 0.5% go today, it's going to come back to you. Right. If you hold that buyer to the fire, you're not going to be in this business for very long because you're going to get a reputation. We do get paid what we're worth. Don't get me wrong. We don't work for free. but make a smart business decision.
Right, I figured. Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're very welcome. Titus.
Hi. So you mentioned that to ask about the city transfer taxes and fees, you talk to your title person. But when it comes to like government required point of sale inspections, like I know Monterey County has a whole separate set of documents, and I'm sure that RTC would know that. But say, for example, I'm writing an offer for someone in, I think like, is it San Francisco or San Jose? They have some sort of sidewalk inspection thing. Like, I just know that from hearing that. But how would I know that if I was writing the offer? Would I talk to the title company? Would I ask the listing agent? Or would that make you seem like you're
title
ignorant?
Company wouldn't know that. That's a great question. Title company will not know that part. TC will know that part, and your local, the association within that area will know. So, for example, in Marin County, the Marin County Association of Realtors has a document that lists all of the required resale inspections. That's where you get it from.
So I could go to whatever, like San Jose Association of Realtors, and look on their website and see if there's any required. Oh, that's perfect. That way I don't have to call the listing agent and seem ignorant. I don't want to seem ignorant when I'm writing an offer.
You might have a disclosure on the MLS saying that stuff too.
Yeah, most association websites will have that information on there. Some probably do not, but most do. That's where you find it. If they don't have it on their website, they have it. So just give them a call or buddy up with somebody in the area that does a lot of business. They would know. Here's a way to kind of cheat around it. Go on to some listings on MLS and in that area and look for a disclosure.io link in the private remarks and get a disclosure package. And if it's a complete disclosure package, you're going to see a bunch of stuff in there. It's going to give a lot of clues. But at the end of the day, check with your local association. They are the ones that have it.
Are you walking through the property with a hard copy of this and filling it out and then putting it in type form? Because that's probably what I would do.
Not necessarily.
Well, like including, stuff that's included, bathroom mirrors, stuff like that. You're not going to remember all that just off memory, right?
No, that's when I'm having a conversation with the listing agent, as Daniel alluded to. You're looking at the MLS, and if MLS does have those things listed in there, I'm not going to confirm that with the listing agent. But if there's items that are not listed in MLS, I will have that conversation with the listing agent. And then I'm going to mark all of those things in the offer, click all those boxes.
So you're going to do it based on your conversation with the listing agent?
Yeah. Usually I'm sitting down or, have something to write down, something to write, a piece of paper to write it down on, but I usually don't have a paper contract to write it down on.
Okay.
When I am walking through the house with my client, I might be making general notes. Absolutely. Like, oh, there's a wine fridge and my client wants that wine fridge. For some reason, I always forget to do that. I don't anymore because now I know to write it down. But a buyer might think that wine fridge is included because it's fit nicely in that little cubby hole. Guess what? Wine fridges, unless they're framed in, they are not included automatically, right? So that's always something that you need to let your buyer know. It's like, do you want that fridge? Yes, I do. Okay, we need to write it in the offer. And have a conversation with the listing agent.
Earlier in the meeting, you brought up like interest rates capping off on a certain percentage. I think you mentioned that was a newer thing we kind of have to look out for, or was that always there?
That has always been there. They just revised the contract to make it stand out. If you look at the previous revision, it wasn't bullet pointed. Now it's bullet pointed because everyone was missing it. Some buyers were wanting to cancel because the interest rate went up to, whatever it was, and it made their mortgage payment go through the roof, and they canceled based on loan contingency. And a lot of them got caught because the lender was fine with 8%. It's just that the buyer wasn't fine with 8%. So if the buyer is not going to be fine with 8%, they need to put that cap in there.
I'm a little confused on how we secure a 6.5% when we know rates can be volatile. And
Yeah.
like, even if you have it in the, like, is the lender stuck with that? Like, how does that affect them, or how do they work with that? I'm a little confused on that.
So really it's giving your buyer an out. They don't have to take the out if they don't want to. But usually the lender, once that lender has a ratified contract, they're calling your client, or they better be calling your client and talking about locking that rate. So if they lock the rate, they're fine. But if maybe the lender will say, don't lock the rate, there's no reason to lock the rate. Rates are coming down. Sometimes you can lock it and it allows it to float down, but it won't allow it to go above what they locked it at, depending on what the loan product is. But again, if it says 6.5% and it bumps up to 6.75, the buyer still has the ability to move forward with it if they want to, so long as the lender says, well, at 6.75, your debt to income ratio is still okay, so we will still fund the loan. If their DTI is not okay anymore, according to the lender, debt to income ratio, because of the rate going way up, the lender will not fund, even if there was not an interest rate cap on the offer, because a lender can no longer fund it based on their funding guidelines. So that is a legitimate reason for the buyer to cancel based on loan contingency.
So if I just want to make sure I understand correctly, so putting a cap on the RPA is really just to give the buyer a chance to back out if, when they do have an executed agreement and it goes up, they can pull out. But I guess to avoid that, what I want to do before we, I guess, submit the earnest money deposit, because that's what locks in the deal, we should chat with our lender to make sure we can even secure the interest rate that the buyer is okay with. Because the RPA doesn't secure the interest rate, it just gives the buyer a chance to pull out if the rate.
Yeah, you definitely want to have a conversation with the lender when you're deciding what rate cap to put in there. And I want to clarify something you said, Miguel, which is a common misconception. The earnest money doesn't lock everything in. What locks everything in is when buyer and seller sign that agreement. That's when escrow starts. So escrow doesn't start when money goes into escrow. That's different. So you have a ratified legal binding contract where both buyer and seller have duties to perform once it's mutually signed. So for example, if you have a mutually signed contract and the buyer never deposits money into escrow and something happened, there's still liability written all over that buyer. So gotcha. That's also a misconception. A lot of agents are like, don't deposit the money in 3 days. Let's just wait a little bit longer because, that way you could just walk away. No, absolutely not. The seller could say, hey, we took our home off the market because we accepted your offer. And now 5 days later, you're walking away. We're going to sue you because the market just crashed. And now our home is worth $50,000 less than what it was when we accepted your offer. And guess who's going to win? That seller's going to win, even though there's no money in escrow. So I just really wanted to make that clear. That's an extreme example, but that's a real example as well.
If the contract's ratified and they've accepted it, who contacts the lender to let them know? Does the escrow company do that? Do we do that? Do we tell our buyers to do that?
So the buyer agent, you, along with your transaction coordinator, I think Tracy sends this over for you actually. Once you have a ratified contract, it's the buyer's obligation to, one, send it to the buyer's lender, and also send it to the title and escrow officer, and open up escrow if it's not already opened by the seller. What you don't want to send to the lender are any disclosures. You don't want to send any pest report or home inspection to a lender at all.
Everybody's CC'd on everything, so it all goes to all the people, usually. There could be a separate title and escrow email that goes to you, and not the lender, that's the case too. So I have like 3 or 4 group emails right now with this one sale.
And never just hit reply all. You don't want to send somebody, you don't want them seeing something.
You had that the last screen share, you showed the inspection, it was an inspection waiver, I'm pretty sure it was.
Yes.
So that's if you have a serious buyer and a motivated seller that pretty much, you want to avoid that step. I looked down at my phone and you were done with it, with that section. So
yeah, what that was is a buyer inspection waiver. So if you go in waiving, buyer inspections or investigation, you want to make sure that your buyer understands what they're doing and they're acting against the advice of you. And so they're acknowledging that separately outside of the contract. Not outside of the contract, but it's a separate instrument outside of the RPA. And it's basically a risk management thing that we like to see when your buyer's going in, just waiving everything.
Yeah, that makes sense.